Well, WVUM was limping along, so to speak. I found them quarters over in the new Student Union, which opened in 1965. The director, Norman A. Whitten, affectionately known as Chink, had a heart attack, and he died in the spring of '66. And before the building could be dedicated, he died, and the students thought he was such a wonderful person, and he was, that the building was named in his honor. Originally called the Norman A. Whitten Student Union, Memorial Student Union. And then later it was changed several years later to the Whitten University Center. Well, that new space in the Student Union was very small, very tiny, and WVUM was cramped, as were many of the other student organizations. And that went on for several years. In the meantime, WVUM started expanding. I remember 1969-70 when I helped the student government get approved a part of their student activity fee to put lights on the baseball field, Mark Light Stadium. And that was approved in 1970. And so the first lighting at night took place, and so the Hurricanes could start playing at night. WVUM always had a special place in broadcasting the UM baseball games. They really got its start with baseball at UM. Roy Firestone, whom you know and has done so well, was one of the early broadcasters. Will, who owns Books Horizons, was also one of the broadcasters. I used to go up there in the top of the stadium with them all the time. I enjoyed them, knew them, and they always enjoyed my coming. I love baseball, so, but I tell you, it's a tough job to announce those games and to do the color. They asked me one time if I'd do the color. I said, sure. Well, I was worn out after 2 innings. I just couldn't keep up with what was going on. So I was glad to have that experience to see how difficult it was. But those games went on, and in the meantime, WVUM was initially, I think it was a 12-watt station in the residence halls, and then it jumped to 100 watts, and then 350 watts, and then I think 1250 is what it is about right now. And each step along the way, we were able to get a special funding and from the students primarily, although we did raise some money off campus. And we worked out a deal with CBS for the antenna that is now on top of, I think it's Heck Residential College that does all the broadcasting. We had to have a high place on the campus to mount that antenna, and as luck would have it, in 1967, we built the first of those 2 high-rise towers. In 1968, we built the other 2 towers. There's a moral to this issue, however, and that is if you don't name the buildings in a hurry, the students are going to name them for you. We learned that. We built the 2 towers in 1967 that would house about 960 students, and we didn't have a name. Well, the students soon named those 2 towers the 960 complex, and the next year, in 1968, we built the next 2 towers. The first 2 towers, 67, are now named in honor of Dr. Stanford, and the other 2 towers are Hecht Residential College. But in '68, those other 2 towers came up, so now we have 4 And the students said, well, what shall we call it? And we didn't have a name. So they decided to call it the 1968 complex. They couldn't call it the 960 complex number 2, so they named it after the year. And later we developed them into residential colleges, and then put names on those colleges. Back in the 70s, I think it was, the Vice President for Academic Affairs was Dr. Carl McHenry. We wanted to try to see if we couldn't find some ways to bring the extra class life of students and the formal classroom experiences of students closer together. So we decided to do a show on WVUM. It's called the Bill and Carl Show, or it might have been the Carl and Bill Show. I can't remember exactly which way it went. But we were on once a week, the two of us, Vice President for Academic Affairs, Vice President for Student Affairs, just talking about the university and having an open line to take any questions that came up from students or anybody else. And we had a lot of fun doing that. And I think it was helpful in those days to get the word of the university out. I talked about panicking a little bit behind doing the color for WVUM baseball game. The show was ready to go on, and the telephone call came in. Carl McHenry is in traffic coming from downtown. He can't get to the university, so you're going to have to be a solo today. But I managed to get through it. But the development of WVUM has been a slow, steady, positive transformation to what it is today. It started out just as a little in-house men's residence halls association communication system, and now it can communicate, I guess, all over South Florida, and hopefully there's still room for expansion to go. But I always felt that there was great value in having a radio station at the university. These licenses are very difficult to get, as you know. And I always saw the opportunity, even though it was a student activity program, financed by student activity fees primarily, although I put some money in later on. I'll come to that. It provided a great opportunity for students to have a formal education, and that it should in some way, either informally or formally, be tied to the School of Communication. And so I fought very hard to keep it alive in the early days. A lot of people felt it was useless and we shouldn't do it, but I think it's proved today that it's a very, very wonderful asset.
Maybe explain a little bit why it was important for WVUM to be a corporation and what exactly that means and what that does.
Well, I think the nearest thing that I can relate it to is the Rathskeller. The Rathskeller is a corporation. I don't know whether you knew that or not, but it's the Rathskeller Inc. Now, it's a little more complicated with the Rathskeller Inc. in that if the University of Miami Board of Trustees were to be responsible for operating the Rathskeller, under the state laws of Florida, every member of the board, and there are about some 80 of them today, not so in the days when the Rathskeller was born 40 years ago, probably 40 or 50 in those days. Each one of them would have had to have been fingerprinted and mugged, their pictures taken, in order for that corporation to be established. And it just didn't seem feasible to do so, nor could a full board of trustees give the kind of attention that was necessary to the Rathskeller. And this relates to the serving of alcohol. In order to be eligible to serve alcohol and wine, beer and wine in the Rathskeller, you had to get a license from the state, and whoever was responsible had to have their pictures taken and fingerprinted. So it was decided the most convenient way to do this was to establish a corporation to run it. And so Doc Stanford again became president of the corporation. Gene Cohen was the treasurer, and I was the secretary. That lasted for about a year, and Doc Stanford wanted to step down, and so I became president of the Rathskeller Corporation. Now, in order to have student input, we decided that it was very important that we had a student advisory board. And so we created a student advisory board that reported to the corporate board. And the corporate board did have a couple of trustees on it, but mainly administrators here at the university. Now that is a parallel to the other. I can't tell you exactly why. I guess one would have to ask that question of legal counsel, but I suspect that there is some reason for the convenience of doing it this way for the university and having a board to oversee it rather than having the full board of trustees responsible.